Welcome to the Living the Dream podcast with Curveball. If you believe, you can achieve. Welcome to the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, a show where I interview guests that teach, motivate, and inspire. Today, I am joined by former major market radio host and stand-up comedian turned best-selling author, Dick Wybrow. We're going to be talking to him about his radio career, about his books, and his comedian career. He was just telling me he was doing some radio out in Missouri. So let's get into it. Dick, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Curtis. I appreciate it, man.
Why don't you start off by telling everybody a little bit about yourself?
Well, you mentioned the radio thing. I actually started in stand-up comedy, and that came from, even though I was a real shy kid, but I had been writing a bit in school because, that's what shy kids do, right? If the world around us isn't something that we're really getting into, let's create a fictional one where we're the hero. So I started writing, but that path is kind of difficult for anybody, especially starting out. And so stand-up comedy seemed logically to somebody who was a bit of an introvert and somebody who's quite shy. It was a way for me to write stories or bits or jokes, whatever it might be, and then that night instantly get on stage and get published. And so that led me into a stand-up comedy career, even though I didn't have any great desire to be up on stage and under the spotlight at all. And then from there, did that for a couple of years, did pretty well. I worked with some pretty big names, at least at the time. And I saw there were fewer and fewer people that were coming out to stand-up clubs. Like in the beginning, when I first started in the early 90s in Minneapolis, it was just when you'd go into the stand-up comedy club, it was just this beautiful wall of people around you, like you're stepping into the Roman Colosseum with fewer lions, which I thought was good. But then when stand-up comedy ended up on television all over the place, I mean, food channels had them, A&E had them, USA had them, all that stuff. There were fewer people coming out to clubs. And so I sort of saw the writing on the wall. How do I keep doing this but keep a career? And so I transitioned into radio. And one of the first radio jobs I got is kind of close in your sort of neck of the woods. I got a job at a country radio station in El Dorado Springs, Missouri, KESM. And it was, the station was so small. When I got in the morning, because I was the morning guy, I was the only live DJ there. There were no dead DJs, mind you, but everything else was on tape. But I would come in and I would have to turn the radio station on. That's how small the place was. And so I did that for some years. Ended up going to Clinton, Missouri, a little bit bigger radio station. Did some radio down in Florida, in Orlando, then in Pensacola, then in Southern California, SoCal. Then ended up, my last radio gig was at a rock station in Atlanta. And so I did that for a good couple of years until I made a transition and did a bit of TV. And then now I'm full-time writing. And within that entire, I'm giving you a big answer here, but I'll give you the whole spiel. So within that entire process, my wife and I were trying to decide where we wanted to go next, because we had done some moving over the years, obviously, with the career. And I'm half New Zealander. My father is Kiwi. And so she was like, well, let's just go to New Zealand, which sounds easy when you say it out loud, but that was a task. So we sold everything we owned for the most part, gave away a bunch of stuff to people, put everything that we had left onto a pallet and moved ourselves to New Zealand. And that's where we are right now in Auckland, New Zealand. Been here for about 11 years.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question. So tell us about where you see the state of radio, because, you were in radio in the early 90s, like you said. I'm in it, but I'm doing internet radio, and a lot has changed as the market has been brought up, by iHeart and been monopolized. So what do you see the state of radio now, back versus back then?
I'll preface this by saying too that like I'm doing some television at the moment, I'm on the producing side, but anytime I know somebody comes from the radio world, I know they're going to be great. There's something about people because radio is such a fascinating medium, right? It's not like TV or movies or any of that, or even stage work. It's all that is to an audience, and where radio is an audience, it's a one-on-one relationship with somebody. When I would do remote gigs and stuff like that, which is when you go out and you're at Duffy's car lot or some mobile phone store or something like that, people would come up to me and they would start a conversation with me. But I realized that they weren't starting a conversation. For them, they were continuing sort of a conversation, a relationship they had with me because they listened to me every day on the radio. So that's what I love, that one-on-one interaction with people on the radio. Now, when I got into radio, it's still great, but it was in that heyday where you had big personalities on the radio and you had the Stearns and all that. So radio had an ability to really tilt the world on its axis. And then something happened around 1998 or so. They kind of took some of the governors off. So at that point, there were limitations to, and I hope this isn't too much in the weeds. Let me know if it is. But at that point, there were limitations on how many radio stations, newspapers, television stations any one group could have. And then I think it was 1998 where those governors came off. And that's when you saw like Clear Channel came in, which eventually became iHeartRadio, as you mentioned. These big Sinclair, all these big companies coming in and gobbling up the little guys. And once they did that, it started to water radio down a bit because like even when I was working at the rock station in Atlanta, our night guy was some dude out of Dallas, and he was talented, but he wasn't from there. And you can pick that up. That's the thing about that one-on-one relationship. I know if you're tuned into me, I know if you know the same restaurants I go to or the same places I hang out at, or, the smog in the air or the fireball that just came across the sky. And you didn't mention that a moment ago. I just saw it 2 seconds ago. That relationship gets dimmed. And I think that water, the bigger that those big conglomerates kind of came in and swooped into radio, I think that watered down a lot of radio. And many of the guys that I knew from radio aren't in there anymore. And more, it's somebody in a studio out of Seattle, and they're voice tracking, as we used to call it, to a dozen different stations. And that was always there in the beginning, just not on that kind of scale. Because the big companies are looking for some profits to come back so they can pay some guy in Seattle one salary and get 12 jobs out of him. And so you see that more and more. I still think there are a lot of opportunities in radio. Where I am here in New Zealand, radio still plays a big part because they don't have those big conglomerates that have taken over the smaller ones, because it's all smaller ones right now. And so it certainly got its place, and I will always have a very special place in my heart for radio because of that relationship you have with the person we're speaking to, that one-on-one. It's rare and it's valuable.
Not only do they do the voice tracking, but that they can do traffic and weather and all that other stuff as well.
Yeah, because everything comes across. They can get an email or they can get a text or whatever it might be with all the different conditions, and they're probably even getting bullet points from their program directors at these radio stations. Here, this is what's happening in town. You can mention this, and then you can go online. When I first started working at that little station in Missouri, I had to go onto CompuServe. Yeah, that's old school. And try and get some news updates, what was happening. Now, if I wanted to pretend that I was, let's say, in Detroit or something like that, I could read through the Facebook pages. I could read through the Detroit newspaper, and I could get a pretty good feel on what was going on and what people were talking about. So you can kind of fake it. It does take a lot more effort, but and I don't know how much people do that. But like I said, radio is an amazing medium and creates amazing talent. And I really hope that it continues to go strong.
Absolutely. Well, talk about what it's like writing with narcolepsy.
Yeah, that is something I discovered after about, I don't know, I guess I would have been in my late 20s at that point. Before that, I just knew that I was always tired. And I sort of assumed everybody was always the way I felt, tired. And my father, when I was younger, he used to joke and say, "Oh, he's going through another growth spurt," which was funny because I'm barely 5'8", and so those growth spurts weren't happening. But I was always tired and taking naps and sleeping through the day. And then my ex-wife, my wife at the time, she went in because she would occasionally, she had some things going on with her health wise, and she would say, "Oh man, I think it might be narcolepsy." And so we ended up going into the doctor, and she spoke with the doctor about having narcolepsy, a specialist, and went back and forth and back and forth. And I was just there, sort of leaning against the door jamb and chiming in when she needed me to answer something and help her out. And the doctor turned to her and said, "No, I don't think you have narcolepsy, but I think he might." And I went, "What?" And something about the way I presented or the way I spoke or whatever it might be convinced him that I might have it. And so I ended up going in and I did the overnight thing where they put all the little suckers on your head and all that, and they watch you while you sleep, which is weird. Having people watch you when you sleep, I should have charged them for that. I think that you could probably actually charge people for that. But then they would wake me up every hour or so and then ask me a quick couple questions and then have me go back to sleep, which probably only exacerbated the narcolepsy. But so once I got a bit of a name on that, it said, "You have narcolepsy," because I am diagnosed with that and I take medication for that. But once I had sort of a name on that, that really was empowering for me, at least in the sense I had somebody to blame. That the narcolepsy person is the problem. But after a while, I started realizing, listen, I'm stuck with this thing. It's not going anywhere. I'm always going to have it. So how can I turn this toward, a benefit? Is there any way to do that? Having something where you're just knocked out tired all the time. Somebody else described it. And again, I don't have any frame of reference, only my own. Somebody else described it saying, stay up for 30 hours, stay up for 30 hours straight. Now go to work and I'll go be with your kids and I'll do your taxes. And so to give you an idea about what it is, because even speaking with you right now, Curtis, I have to focus. I have to really focus. Otherwise my mind will drift and I'll forget I'm even speaking to you. So when I started to decide that I wanted to make narcolepsy more of something that was a positive in my life, I realized that I did have something. Do you know when you're falling asleep and those last couple of minutes before you drift off to sleep, where your mind starts to wander, you come up with these crazy ideas and these interesting thoughts or solutions to problems, and you say to yourself, that's it. I got to do something with that. I should write that down. No, don't worry about that. I'll remember that in the morning, and you never do. So that dream state that you feel like you're in, where you're drifting in and out, that's where I am 85% of the day, in that particular dream state. So I actually see narcolepsy as a superpower for me, because being in that dream state where my mind wanders and goes off to places where I wouldn't normally during the day, because my conscious mind would say, don't do that. That's crazy. Because I'm in that dream state, it helps me create. And it has helped me create. I've written 8 out of 9 books in one series. I'm just finishing up the 3rd book in another series, and people seem to be responding to that. And I do think, because some of it is obviously a little bit on the more outrageous side on occasion, I do think that some of those ideas absolutely come from having narcolepsy. So it is a struggle. It's not easy day to day, and there are times where I get frustrated, but knowing that having a name for it and then being able to turn it around on its head and actually putting it to work has been really empowering and a positive force in my life.
Well, speaking of your books, you write books that make people laugh out loud. So take us through your writing process and tell us how you write books that have people laughing out loud.
Man, that is such a gift to me, when somebody says that something I wrote made them laugh out loud, because when I read, I guess it's tough. Humor is such a strange thing, right? An analogy I've used on occasion is, if you want to make somebody sad, their dog has died. You want to make them mad, kill the dog. But to make somebody laugh, to bring a bit of humor, it's real voodoo. And so it's really difficult to kind of put a bit of a process behind it. But you do pick it, like I've been doing it for some 30 years or so. So eventually you sort of pick up on the bits and pieces and how to phrase stuff and not phrase stuff to be able to create humorous moments. And so when people do read something I've written and they find themselves laughing or saying, I laughed out loud at this, that is such a joy for me to know that something I've written here in my home office / 2-car garage in Auckland, New Zealand, that somebody in Wichita might pick it up, next month, next year, 10 years from now. And it's almost like this strange little immortality that goes on, where they're laughing at a moment that was conceived all these months or years earlier. It's really, really cool. But my mornings basically start, I get up because of the narcolepsy. Ironically, I also have insomnia. So I'm usually up before 4 o'clock in the morning. which is a good time to be up for them. Aside from being tired, which I'm always tired, it's a good time to be up because if you're up at 4 o'clock in the morning, if you go to a 24-hour grocery store, you will find you are first in line. If you go to a gas station a little bit later on, I am once again first in line. So it's a good time to be up in the morning, and it's quiet. And so I spend the first couple hours of my day doing some writing, putting stories together. And then once the brain starts to melt, because it does take a lot out of you, being creative, as you know, Curtis, creativity does sort of wring your brain out. You can't do it for 8 hours. Like I do, as I mentioned, I do some television producing. I can do that 10 hours a day and be fine because it's a different type of creativity. But when you're funneling all your energy into creativity for hours at a time, you are wiped out. So the latter half of my day is spent do some editing, answer some people on Facebook or emails, do some marketing, whatever it might be. But yeah, it's that first part of the day, that shiny golden part of the day between about 4:30 and 9 o'clock in the morning or so. That's my fun zone where I get to go hang out with my friends in my imaginary world.
Well, when you are working on a book or a series, do you plot it out or do you just wing it?
Yeah, so the two of them you hear about are the plotters and the pantsers. And some people who are pantsers don't like to be called that. They like to be the posh about it. We're discovery writers. And that just means you don't know what you're doing. You have no idea where you're going. So, and most writers are a combination of both those things. They're both plotters and pantsers, right? Or plotters and discovery writers. So when I go into stories, there's some writers like, and I've heard Isaac Asimov was this way, for example, where he knew each chapter, he knew what was happening, he knew what every character was going to do. He'd just map it out like a blueprint. And so he would go in and treat like a workday, 9 to 5 or whatever it might be, and go through his blueprint. And when 5 o'clock whistle went, he was done. And 9 a.m., he start back up again on his blueprint. For folks like me, I come into it and I usually have a bit of an idea about how the story might end. As long as I have the characters, as long as I knew who the characters are, and as long as I've taken time to kind of develop them into my head, they will start to tell me the story. They will start to make choices for me. And trust me, I know how flaky that sounds. I get it, but it's true. They start to inform me where the story is going. So like in this last story that I was doing, I honestly did not know how it was going to end. The first book in the Kane series, I did know how it was going to end. I had a pretty good idea how it was going to end. And so I had a bit of a roadmap. And this one, I have two strong characters. And it was actually funny. There was a conversation I was having with a reader group up in the UK. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but basically the idea behind the Kane series, I know you were going to ask about it, so I won't get too much into it, is in a very small nutshell, it's about a wolf who's up in the British Columbian woods, and the wolf gets bitten by an infected man. And the next day the wolf wakes up and they're human. And so this is a story about how this human is working out through the world. And so when we meet Kane, the main character, he's about 25 years old, basically, and he's partnered up with this young woman named Imelda, and they're searching for something. Well, so then I was on this conversation with these folks in the UK, and this woman said to me, I had just started writing book 3, and I was kind of getting a bit of a grip on it, and I'd taken a break to speak to this readers group. And this woman in the UK said, I can't wait to hear more about Kane and how he grew up and what it was like when he was younger. And I was like, of course, that's exactly what I'm doing now in the book that I'm writing. and that helped me a lot, actually, that interaction. It was almost like the days of the radio, where you're sort of that one-on-one conversation. But her interest in that, as others had mentioned before, she kind of put it in sharp relief. She kind of helped me get in my head. You know what? People are really interested in those early days of Kane back when he was in British Columbia and what it was like for him to kind of come to terms with these two lovely people that brought him in and sort of raised him, what his life was like back then. And so that has been one of the spines or one of the running threads in this latest book. And so that has been a fantastic and a fun process. And it's really neat in 2023 to be able to have people interact with you and sort of share the story creation process in some way. I've really enjoyed that. And like I said, I answer all my emails, I answer all of this. And so I love that interaction with people to hear what's in their head and answering it.
Well, what is your number one goal when you craft the story? This is a two-part question. Tell us about your number one goal when crafting a story, and what is the most rewarding part of being an author?
I think the number one goal for me is just to tell a story that will interest people, something. I think it'd be too lofty to say something that makes people laugh or something that makes people happy, whatever. But there's always so much going around in our own lives that aren't quite going the way we want to. So to create a bit of a space, a book, to create some space where there's a couple of characters and they run into troubles and they solve it. They run into problems and they work it out. And so there's some element to that for a reader that will get into a story and they'll see that solution, and it does seem to speak to them. So to be able to give somebody that sort of gift of a fun story, interesting characters, maybe a funny line or two here and there, but a nice ending where you come away with a smile, that I think is the number one goal for me, is to give that gift to somebody, as best as I can, give them that, and so they can enjoy that. And I think the most rewarding thing is hearing their response to that, hearing people say how much they enjoyed some part of the book, how much they enjoyed a particular character. I mean, when you hear somebody repeat back what one character said that you wrote 6 months ago, as if that's somebody right? Because basically they see Kane and Imelda and all these other characters, Gregor, all these people. I guess they see them as my friends, that I hang out with them. And in all reality, they hang out in my head, so we are friends. So people speak to me on occasion as if they're real people to some extent. And that is really rewarding. I get a real kick out of that. And just knowing that people find them funny and are enjoying it and get excited about the new one coming out, which the new one comes out here. The third book comes out here just right near the end of December. I've got people asking me about, hey, when's this going to happen? And it's really a thrill. Having that sort of, it's such a solitary experience writing. It's very lonely sitting in this little room for all your time. And so with that being about 85-90% of what I do, that rewarding part of interacting with people who are readers who are enjoying what you're doing is very rewarding. It's immensely rewarding. One of the best things in my opinion.
So tell us about your books to tell listeners what they can expect when they read them.
So all of my books, my wife pointed this out to me. Basically, all of my books are about people who are, I'll use the word marginalized, but basically people that you wouldn't think much of, right? For the most part, these are people that they aren't superheroes. They're not CEOs of companies. They're not actors. They're nothing like this. They're little people like most of us. And they're put into extraordinary situations. And when they come together, especially several of them come together, they thrive. And it's the same thing with this latest book with Kane. Kane, he gets bitten, as I mentioned, by, in simple terms, there's a guy who's been infected by a virus that it turns him into a super soldier, bites Kane, and Kane ends up turning into a human. He was a wolf, now he's a human. And so it's a reverse werewolf because he is affected by the moon. When the moon comes out, he's a 6'7" French Canadian, but when the moon comes up, he turns into basically a werewolf. But one thought within that was, as a writer, I was like, why don't want the fun part of this to just be when the full moon comes out? And then why is it just the full moon? Why are werewolves only affected by the full moon? What if Kane, as a human, was affected by a half moon, a quarter moon, a sliver of a moon, let's say? What would that be? So that would be a lesser sort of wolf or lesser werewolf. So what is a lesser wolf or werewolf? Well, that's a dog, actually. So what happens is when Kane goes into the moonlight, and if it's like a little sliver of a moon, he turns into a little lapdog. If it's a half moon, he might turn into a pug. If it's a 3/4 moon, he'll turn into a Rottweiler, building up to the full moon. And so that, once I had that in my head, that made it really fun for me. This idea that he tries to avoid the moonlight because his human parents, the two that raised him, always told him to avoid the moonlight because they know what happens. So through this story, basically, it's his quest to try and find who this person was who bit him, what's the story behind it, and if he can find some way to get back to his wolf pack. Because he's been, within that short span of time, he's only been a human for a year by the time we meet him in the book. It's only been a short span of time, but he's decided, listen, I much prefer being a wolf. I've been a human for a year, and I prefer running around naked in the woods. I suppose you could run around naked in the woods as a human, but that might involve incarceration. So you don't want to do that. So since he was a wolf, he's worked out English language. He also speaks French, which actually one of the first things he spoke, because the man who raised him, a man and woman raised him, the man spoke French to him first. So he actually speaks with a French Canadian accent. He's worked out bits and pieces about humans, and he does see humans through the lens of an animal, which is really fun. And I think when you mention the laugh out loud stuff, that's often what I hear from my readers. They love those scenes where we see it from Kane's perspective. Everything is written in the third person until we get to Kane, and that's first person, where he's talking about what he sees and what he's going through and what's going through his head. And so he sees the world in a very naive but wise way in some ways, throughout the entire story. So, but the one thing he can't seem to get a grip on is driving. He's got everything down, but this whole thing in the transition from wolf into human, he does not have the motor skills to drive. And so he finds, through happenstance, this young woman named Imelda, who is a part-time criminal, did a bit of getaway driving in her time, and her ex-boyfriend has now been put in prison, and she's working in these dive bars, and she needs a better job. He needs someone to drive. They come together. And so basically she ends up being his driver in this story, driving him around to kind of investigate this person who bit him, the biting man they call him initially. And she slowly gets more and more invested into his story. And so she's kind of a broken person herself, because, didn't have a great growing up. When she was growing up, it wasn't great. She's fallen into hard times as a sort of a low part-time criminal. And obviously, Kane being an ex-wolf or part-time wolf with now being a human, he's kind of broken himself. And so when they come together as a team, they actually find that they're great together, that they work really well together, and that they need each other. And so I've heard some people call that found family, I suppose. But that, for me, is a really neat joy, because my other series has something similar. All these people come together, sort of marginalized folks, but when they come together, they're a powerful force. And I believe that. I really, truly believe that when it comes to life in general. Me, I'm a bit of a busted up person myself. But with my wife, I think I'm far more. I think together we are a powerful force. And so I do believe when people that are a bit busted, like we all are, if we find the right folks around us, we're unstoppable. And that I reflect a bit in the series with Kane, and how they take on giant multinational corporations and super soldiers and monsters, and they can do it because they're together.
Okay, well, tell us about any current or upcoming projects that you're working on that people need to know about.
That's taken up all my headspace at the moment. I'm really excited about. I got contacted just within a few weeks of putting the first Kane book out. It just came out a few months ago, but within the first few weeks of that, I got contacted by the folks at Podium Audio, and I don't know if you're familiar with them, but one of the big hits they first kind of got into was a book called The Martian, written by Andy Weir. But they found The Martian and they turned it into an audiobook, and that became such a huge hit. Obviously, it turned into a film with Matt Damon and this sort of thing. Well, those are the folks who approached me, and they have a great path, right? Sort of the arc of how they create stuff. And they said, "Listen, we love what you've done. We love this story. We want to turn your first 3 books into audiobooks." And so for me, that is a thrill. That is going to be such a fascinating thrill for me. They've now told me who the 2 narrators are going to be, because one's going to be Imelda through the entire story, because she's mainly the narrator through the story. But on the first person stuff with Kane, they've got this other guy who's knocked out of the park. They're both great. This guy's really very well known in the audiobook world. But those are going to be coming out very soon. And I'm fascinated to see how I'm going to react to that. I mean, keeping in mind, like I mentioned, Curtis, I create stuff in this room at 4:00 in the morning by myself, sitting here by myself. And now, very soon, there are going to be voices that are acting out those words I came up in this room. And that is a real thrill. I'm stoked about that. I can't wait to hear what that sounds like. It's going to be like me hearing the story for the first time. And it'd be really fascinating to hear how they interpret the characters. So that is coming up here very shortly. Keep an eye out for it. But I could be more thrilled about it.
Well, so listeners can keep up with everything that you're up to. Throw out your contact information, any websites or anything like that.
Yeah, the best bet is just the website, dickwybrow.com. And I think, Curtis, you'll probably have the spelling down there, because people try and complicate it. It's pretty simple, just dickwybrow.com. If you're interested in the Kane books, they're all available on Amazon. because Amazon sort of rules the world in the book industry. If you're more of a paperback fan, though, you can grab those all over the world as a paperback. Just Google online where you are. Like here in New Zealand, you can get them at Mighty Ape. In the US, you can get them online at Walmart and Barnes and Noble, various places. You can get them up in the UK as well. So yeah, just head on to the website. I'll keep people updated on that, or follow on the Facebook page. I have all my announcements on that. But yeah, the more the merrier. I'd love to be able to share this adventure with as many people as I can.
Close us out with some final thoughts. Maybe if there was something I forgot to talk about that you would like to touch on, or just any final thoughts you have for the listeners.
I guess one of the final thoughts I have, if I were to give you one off the top of my head, was a lot of this has been about me creating and putting my words out there. And I know you very likely have creators as well. And for the creators out there that are trying to get their stuff out in the world, don't forget how many other people around you support you and lift, and you can't do it without them. So when they come to you and they start speaking with you, this is not always going to be your opportunity just to get in what you need to say. You shouldn't, like, for example, my wife, when she comes and talks to me, that's not just my opportunity to tell her all the stuff I'm doing. That's not just my opportunity to tell her about all the cool things happening in my story. It's not my job to sit there and watch her lips stop moving so I can get in there and get my thing said. Listen to them. Let them get their stuff out. They may not have the big boisterous personality like other creators have, but they have a hell of a lot to share. And listening to them makes their lives better. It makes your life better. And pay attention. And if nothing else, they might say something you could use. But it's really, really powerful to empower other people around you, to be able to lift other people around you. It feels great for you. It's good for them. And it really makes the rest of the world better. So I would say as creators, as some A-type personalities, make sure we're letting other people in and getting their word in, because they have a lot to say. It's important they say it, and it'll make your life better.
Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, DickWybrow.com. Please be sure to check out his books and check out everything that he's up to. Follow, rate, review, share this episode to as many people as possible. If you have any guest suggestions, cjackson102 at cox.net is the place to send them. As always, thank you for listening. And Dick, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story today.
Thank you, Curtis. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody listening as well.
For more information on the Living the Dream podcast, visit www.djcurveball.com. Until next time, stay focused on living the dream.